A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at the news this morning, and there is this strange, heavy silence that seems to be settling in. It is March 16th, 2026, and the January ceasefire is holding, technically, but it feels like everyone is just waiting for the other shoe to drop. It got me thinking about what happens when the sirens stop, but the internal alarm is still ringing at full volume. We are seeing the quiet on the ground, but the noise in the brain is louder than ever.
You are right, Korn. We often focus on the physical reconstruction, the concrete and the steel, but the structural damage to the human psyche is far more difficult to survey. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the lasting effects of living through war on both the individual and the collective. He wants us to look at how the psychology of ordinary civilians is subtly and sometimes permanently reshaped by these experiences. We are not talking about the politics of the border today. We are talking about the permanent psychological footprint left on a society when the mourning process is structurally impossible.
We are talking about a generation that has been through a meat grinder, not just in terms of the physical danger, but the sheer duration of it. We are looking at over 16 months of high-intensity conflict. Herman Poppleberry, you've been digging into this frozen psyche concept that has been popping up in the research lately, specifically in 972 magazine. What are we looking at here?
The term frozen psyche is used by psychologists and analysts to describe a state where the normal mourning process simply fails. Usually, when a traumatic event happens, the brain goes through a sequence. There is the shock, the processing of grief, and eventually a slow integration of that event into your life story. But when traumatic events occur in such rapid succession that you never leave survival mode, that process jams. The brain stops mourning because it cannot afford the luxury of vulnerability.
So the brain essentially says, I do not have time to cry because I have to figure out where the nearest shelter is for the next one. It is like the mourning process is a software update that keeps getting paused because the system is under a constant cyber attack.
That is a very accurate way to put it. If you are constantly in a state of hypervigilance, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex reasoning and emotional regulation, takes a backseat to the amygdala. The amygdala is your internal siren. When that siren never stops, you do not process the trauma, you just store it in a raw, unrefined state. It becomes a permanent part of your operating system rather than a file you have archived. This differs from standard post-conflict recovery because in a standard scenario, there is a clear after. Here, the after is just a lower volume version of the during.
And that is not just an individual thing, right? You mentioned the collective. If an entire society is stuck in that raw storage phase, how does that change the way people interact with each other?
It erodes the social foundations. When a community is traumatized, the community itself can become a trauma vector. In collectivist societies, which we see in both Israeli and Palestinian contexts, the suffering of your neighbor is not just something you feel bad about, it is something that reinforces your own sense of peril. The Rand Corporation and Foreign Policy recently put out an analysis warning that Gaza's reconstruction has to start with the psychology of its youth. If you build new buildings on top of a frozen social foundation, the instability remains. You are essentially building on psychological quicksand.
I want to get into the biology of this because I think people assume trauma is just feeling bad, but there are hardware changes happening here. I remember we touched on this a bit in episode 891 when we talked about survival psychology, but the intergenerational aspect is what really gets me. How does this move from the event to the biology of a child who was not even there?
The neurobiology is both terrifying and fascinating. There is a lot of research on the offspring of Holocaust survivors that we are seeing mirrored in current studies. Specifically, researchers look at glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity. Glucocorticoids are hormones, like cortisol, that help your body respond to stress. In children of survivors who experienced extreme, prolonged trauma, we see an increased sensitivity in these receptors.
Wait, so the kids are born with a stress response that is already dialed up to 11, even if they have never seen a day of war themselves?
That is what the data suggests. It is an epigenetic change. The parents' experiences alter the way certain genes are expressed in the next generation. It is almost as if the body is trying to prepare the child for a dangerous world before they are even born. It is an evolutionary adaptation that has gone haywire in the modern world. In a jungle, being hyper alert is good. In a modern city, that heightened sensitivity just translates to a much higher risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. The body is literally passing down a biological warning signal.
It is like being born with a smoke detector that goes off every time someone lights a candle. That seems like a recipe for a permanent state of societal exhaustion. And it is not just the kids, right? This stays with the survivors for their entire lives.
It does. There was a study published in Nature Scientific Reports in 2023 that looked at Polish survivors of World War II. They found that even 75 years later, these individuals had significantly altered embodiment levels.
Embodiment levels. Break that down for me.
It refers to how you perceive and inhabit your own body. Survivors often feel a sense of detachment or a lack of safety within their own skin. This study showed that these effects persisted for 3/4 of a century. So when we look at the current situation in early 26, where you have 1.4 million people in Gaza displaced in tent camps and thousands of Israelis dealing with unprecedented levels of trauma, we are not just looking at a bad couple of years. We are looking at a shift in how these populations will physically experience the world for the rest of the century.
That brings up a term I have been seeing more often lately. Moral injury. It is different from standard post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Because I think people use them interchangeably. But there is a nuance there that seems really important for what is happening now.
You are right to point that out. Post-traumatic stress disorder is generally understood as a fear-based response to a threat to your life or safety. Moral injury is deeper. It is the psychological distress that results from actions, or the lack of actions, that transfix or violate your core moral beliefs. It is about a sense of betrayal, either by yourself, your leaders, or your society.
So it is not just I was scared I was gonna die. It is I saw something or did something that makes me feel like I am no longer a good person, or I realize the system I trusted does not actually care about me.
That is it. It is the shattering of the moral framework. For a soldier, it might be an order they had to carry out that haunts them. For a civilian, it might be the realization that they were left unprotected for hours on October 7th, 2023. For a Palestinian civilian, it is the feeling that the world watched their entire neighborhood be leveled and did nothing. When that moral framework breaks, it is much harder to fix than a fear response. You can desensitize someone to a loud noise, but how do you desensitize someone to the loss of their moral universe?
That seems to be where the personality shift Daniel mentioned comes in. If you stop believing in a predictable moral world, you probably become a lot more cynical, a lot more insular. Moving from the individual brain to the collective social structure, how does this manifest in the community?
You see a collapse of what we call protective layers. These are the things that usually buffer us from the harshness of the world, faith, family, and community institutions. In Gaza, those layers have not just been thinned, they have been pulverized. When you lose your home, your school, your mosque or church, and your extended family all at once, the self that emerges from that is going to be fundamentally different. It is often more reactive, more prone to externalizing anger in boys or deep internalizing depression in girls, as recent studies of Gazan youth have shown.
And on the Israeli side, you have adolescents who are growing up with this fear of the other that has been reinforced by the most violent event in the country's history. It seems like both sides are being pushed into these divergent but mirrored paths of damage.
The divergence is quite striking in the clinical data. In Israeli youth, the trauma often manifests as a hyperfixation on security and a deep-seated suspicion of anyone outside the immediate group. It is a defensive crouch. In Gaza, because the destruction has been so total, the damage is more about the total loss of a future-oriented perspective. If you do not know where you will sleep tomorrow, you stop planning for next year. That lack of a future self is a devastating psychological state for a teenager.
While the neurobiology is clear, the sociological impact is where we see the long-term generational shifts. I look at historical parallels like post-war Japan or Bosnia. Did they have this same frozen psyche issue?
They did, but the outcomes were different based on how the reconstruction was handled. In post-World War II Japan, there was a massive state-led effort to redefine the national identity away from militarism. In Bosnia, however, the lack of a shared narrative has led to a society that is still deeply divided and prone to high risk tolerance and low interpersonal trust. Lebanon is another example where the civil war ended, but the psychological war never did, leading to a permanent state of political paralysis. The current situation in Gaza and Israel is unique because of the intensity and the high-tech nature of the surveillance and destruction.
I wonder about the role of technology in this. We have seen AI used for targeting in this war, and we have seen social media used to broadcast the trauma in real time. Does that high-tech aspect change the psychological footprint?
It certainly accelerates the frozen state. In the past, there was a lag time. Information traveled slower. Now, you are seeing the destruction of your own neighborhood on a 5-inch screen in your hand while it is happening. That level of real-time trauma saturation is unprecedented. It means there is no away anymore. You can be in a displacement camp in the south of Gaza and watching your home in the north be demolished on Telegram. It creates a state of continuous traumatic stress rather than post-traumatic stress. The post part never arrives.
That is a terrifying distinction. Continuous versus post. It is like the difference between being hit by a car and being stuck under a car that is slowly revving its engine. Even with the ceasefire, the revving continues.
That is the reality of it. As of mid-February, 591 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire began in January. There are still threats of a wider conflict with Iran. For a civilian in Tel Aviv or Gaza City, the war has not ended, it has just changed its volume. This prevents the unfreezing of the psyche, because the threat is still perceived as active.
So, if we're looking at the next 5 to 10 years, what does a society with a frozen psyche look like in practice? Does it mean more radical politics? Does it mean a total breakdown in trust?
Historically, you see a high tolerance for risk and a low tolerance for nuance. People move towards strongman politics because they crave the illusion of absolute security. Interpersonal trust also takes a massive hit. If you cannot trust the world to be safe, it is very hard to trust your neighbor to be honest. We saw this in episode 878 when we talked about the science of resilience. It is not just about bouncing back. Sometimes you bounce back into a shape that is much harder and more brittle than you were before.
Brittle is the perfect word. A brittle society can look strong on the outside, but it shatters under pressure rather than bending. That is the danger of ignoring the psychological recovery. You can build the most advanced defense systems and the most modern cities, but if the people living in them are brittle, the whole system is unstable.
Right. And this is where social acknowledgement comes in. Research shows that how well a society collectively recognizes and validates trauma survivors' experiences significantly moderates long-term post-traumatic stress disorder severity. But in a conflict like this, social acknowledgement is often a zero-sum game. People feel that if they acknowledge the trauma of the other side, they are somehow betraying or diminishing their own trauma.
Right. It is the competitive victimhood trap. My pain is bigger than your pain, so I do not have to look at yours. If I admit you are hurting, it somehow makes my hurt less valid.
And that is what keeps the psyche frozen. To unfreeze, you need a sense of safety, and safety requires a predictable social environment. If you are constantly denying the reality of the people living 10 miles away from you, and they are doing the same to you, you are creating a fundamentally unpredictable and hostile environment for everyone. You cannot heal in a vacuum. The lack of a shared narrative is a structural barrier to recovery.
You mentioned that the reconstruction needs to start with the youth. What does that look like? Are we talking about mass therapy? Because that seems impossible given the scale.
It has to be more than just clinical therapy. It has to be about rebuilding those protective layers we talked about. It is about creating schools that are not just places of learning, but places of extreme psychological safety. It is about community programs that encourage the unfreezing of the narrative, allowing people to talk about what happened without fear of judgment or reprisal. It requires a level of courage that goes beyond the battlefield.
This sounds like a massive, multi-generational investment in mental health infrastructure that is basically equivalent to the Marshall Plan, but for the brain.
That is precisely what is needed. The American Psychiatric Association has been sounding the alarm on this, but the funding and political will are usually directed toward physical infrastructure. It is easier to show a picture of a newly built bridge than it is to show a picture of a child who no longer wakes up screaming. But the child is the one who will eventually decide whether that bridge stays standing.
It is a sobering thought. We are looking at a landscape where the primary export of the region for the next decade might just be trauma, unless there is a radical shift in how we approach peace. Peace is not just the absence of falling bombs, it is the presence of psychological security.
And that security is incredibly fragile right now. Even the terminology we use matters. When we talk about reconstruction, if we do not include the word healing in the same sentence, we are failing to understand the scope of the problem. We have to address the moral injury of the soldiers returning home and the frozen psyche of the civilians who stayed.
I think about the adolescents you mentioned, the ones who are 16 or 17 now. They are going to be the leaders in 20 years. If their foundational experience of the world is that it is a place where your home can vanish and your moral framework is a lie, how do they even begin to negotiate a different future?
That is the big question. The thaw is painful. When a frozen limb starts to warm up, it hurts. The same is true for a psyche. Processing that grief and that moral injury is going to be an incredibly painful process for both societies. But the alternative is a permanent state of brittleness.
The first step is simply acknowledging that the frozen state exists. You cannot fix a problem you are pretending is not there. And right now, there is a lot of pretending going on, because the alternative is so overwhelming.
The scale is unprecedented. We are talking about millions of people. But we have to remember that resilience is also a biological reality. The human brain is plastic. It can change. The same mechanisms that allow trauma to be encoded also allow for healing, but it requires the right environment. You cannot grow a plant in a freezer. You have to turn the heat on first.
I like that analogy. The ceasefire is the freezer door opening, but it is not the heat. The heat has to come from somewhere else. I think that is a good place to transition into some practical takeaways. Because as heavy as this is, there are people listening who are researchers, or who are living through this, or who have family there. What can we do with this information?
The first takeaway is the importance of social validation as a moderating variable. If you are interacting with someone who has been through this, the simple act of acknowledging the reality of their trauma without immediately pivoting to a political argument is a form of psychological first aid. It helps unfreeze that narrative. Validation is not agreement. It is the recognition of human suffering.
And for the policymakers or those in the humanitarian space, the takeaway is that mental health is not a luxury to be addressed after the buildings are up. It is the foundation. If the youth in Gaza and Israel do not have access to long-term multi-generational support, the stability of the region will be a mirage. We need to move away from short-term crisis intervention and toward permanent mental health infrastructure. We need to stop treating a panic attack as a secondary issue to a broken road.
Finally, we need to be able to identify the signs of frozen collective behavior in our own political discourse. When you see absolute cynicism, a total lack of empathy for the other, or a hyperfixation on security at the expense of all other values, you are looking at the symptoms of a traumatized society. Recognizing that can help us respond with something other than more aggression. It allows us to ask, what happened to these people, rather than what is wrong with these people.
That shift in perspective is the beginning of the thaw. It is a long road ahead. If the ceasefire holds, the real work is just beginning, and it is not going to be done with bulldozers. It is going to be done in quiet rooms and in the slow, difficult process of rebuilding trust.
It is the work of decades, not months. But it is the only work that actually leads to a lasting peace. We have to remember that the psychological footprint of this war will be felt long after the last tent is folded.
Well, thank you for walking through the dark parts of the research with me today, Herman. It is not easy stuff, but it is necessary to understand the world we are living in.
It is what we do. I am glad we could dig into it.
We should probably wrap it up there. If you are interested in more of the survival psychology side of things, I really recommend going back to episode 891. We looked at the internal architecture of resilience during the initial escalation, and it provides a lot of the groundwork for what we talked about today.
And episode 878, Beyond the Tunnels, is great for understanding the medical and psychological protocols for survivors of extreme, prolonged captivity and trauma. It really complements the discussion on the frozen psyche.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtopf, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. We literally could not do this deep of a dive without them.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these discussions valuable, the best way to support us is to leave a review on your podcast app. It really helps other people find the show and join the conversation.
We will be back next time with whatever Daniel sends our way.
Catch you then.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.